الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وبيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. لا إله إلا أنت ربي أستغفرك وأتوب إليك إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمي خاتم الرسل أجمعين. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We start supplicating Allah's name, the creator of the worlds, the creator of the universe, the creator of life, recognizing our dependency on God and our need for God, for all meaning and all values and all worth is contingent on the will of the Creator, the maker of the heavens and the earth, and attesting to the truth that there will be a time for accountability, a time where justice will be achieved and where people will be held responsible for what they've committed and what they've omitted. And we pray for peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and all the prophets that Allah has sent to humanity one after another until the final prophet, at a time when humanity has neared its end and has matured sufficiently so it can preserve the testament of faith in a book rather than rely on miracles. And when humanity reached that point, the prophecy ended, and the responsibility was fully borne by human beings to become Allah's deputies, God's deputies and viceroys and representatives on this earth. When we become God's representatives on this earth, the divine will, God's will, only materializes through us, human beings. It only comes to fruition through us. It is us, human beings, as fully accountable and responsible agents who do good and who also do bad. And we, as human beings, each of us individually, but also as societal units collectively, we are held accountable and responsible before God. But for divinity to be represented well on this earth, for God's purposes, for God's will that this earth would manifest adl, manifest justice, manifest ihsan, manifest beauty and virtue, that for goodness to manifest on this earth, by the end of prophecy, by the time that we reach this point in human history when God will send no further prophets, because the final one was Muhammad, it meant, as I have emphasized and underscored many times, that human beings must develop certain virtues within themselves and hold one another accountable for these virtues. These ethical virtues, these virtues that function at the individual level, but also at the civic level, and also at the political level, and also at the level of conduct between nations. These virtues are several, but among them is honesty, truth and testimony, equity, fairness towards the oppressed and weak, holding power responsible and accountable, and many others. What I want to focus on today is an exemplar, is an illustration of how we as agents of God, having received the final message, the best preserved message of all the divine revelations. The Torah was not as well preserved, and the Injil, the New Testament, was not as well preserved, and among the divine revelations The Qur'an is the best revealed, best preserved, and that is in part why it is the final revelation and the final message of the final Prophet ﷺ. Again, if we are to discharge our obligations as human beings, as God's deputies on this earth, as Khulafa'ullah, as God's viceroys on this earth, God's representatives, it means that anchored within ourselves must be certain virtues. Otherwise, the entire dynamic can lead to the opposite of what is godly and divine. A human being that is not armed with ethics is a dangerous thing, but is particularly dangerous when that human being who is not armed with ethics attempts to engage the divine final revelation of God and claim through this engagement that they can discharge the representation of God on earth. And put it bluntly, an unethical human being engaging the final revelation, the Word of God, will result in disasters and, if sad, corruption and ugliness, and will produce trauma that is quite the opposite of what is godly. So let's take an example that comes from a number of recent events. Sadly, perhaps in response to ISIS, perhaps in response to Daesh, I'm not sure. But as we know, organizations like ISIS and Daesh, in their mode of rebellion against modernity and Western hegemony, attempted to ignore not just the economic development of modernity, but also attempted to reject any human values that emerged with the colonial period and the post-colonial period. Because it is fundamentally a reactionary movement that wants to protest against Western hegemony, while the idea of protesting against Western hegemony is appealing, the foundations and the premises that they chose for that rebellion was anchored in an ahistorical paradigm. In other words, they wanted to ignore the march of history and the progress of history. And in doing so, they dumped all the ethical teachings in the past 500 years or so and claimed to return to a pristine Islam. And part of that claim, and the part that concerns me the most in this khutbah, part of that claim was that in Islam, you can wage war you can capture prisoners of war, and you can turn them into captives, i.e. slaves. In the ancient world and in the medieval world, slavery, especially through debt and through war, was very common. It was as common as stock markets in our modern world. Much of the ancient world's economy and much of the medieval world's economy had numerous sociological accommodations to the institution of slavery that were as varied between racial slavery as what existed in the United States and some British and Dutch and French colonies, and purely economic slavery like existed in Mamluk Egypt, where eventually the slaves took charge and established an entire kingdom and an empire ruled and led by slaves. The historical practice is complex, but where are the ethics in this? For people like Daesh, they imagined that perhaps slavery became evil only because the West said it's evil. And imagined that although Islam as a theology, and not just Islam, but the religion of Ibrahim والسلام, to Muhammad والسلام, the very basic foundational premise is that you worship Allah, your ubudiyya, your status as a servant of Allah, means that you cannot be in this ubudiyya, in this slave-like status to anyone but Allah. That is why our ancestors, the early Muslims, were famous among nations that when they would enter into the presence of kings, and by the way, this is reported about the Prophet Ibrahim onwards, that all the Abrahamic prophets, they would refuse to prostrate and sometimes even bow, even just bow down to anyone but God. So when they would enter upon kings, and in the medieval world and the ancient world, prostrating before kings was very, very common. It was the norm. And it was Muslims, through their conduct, that rebelled against that norm and caught the world's attention. They were sort of known that if someone enters into the presence of a king and refuses to prostrate, Europe and Asia knew that this person would be Muslim. Now, I am not actually going to talk about Daesh in this khutbah. What I'm going to address are people who should know better than Daesh. And that is a group of new scholars who don't support Daesh, don't support ISIS, but who started blurring the lines on the question of slavery and saying, well, if Islam didn't, like other religions, because Judaism and Christianity didn't either, if it's just Judaism, Christianity, and Islam didn't come and ban slavery outright, then maybe, just maybe, slavery is not morally reprehensive, ethically reprehensive, but it is forbidden on or allowed on purely pragmatic socio-political grounds. In other words, it's not morality that demands the banning of slavery, but rather historical circumstance that demands the banning of slavery. The implication in this, and then some of them even went as far as saying, well, the Prophet had slaves. Well, the Qur'an itself supports the proposition that there are slaves. Sadly, there are, I believe, political motivations behind this type of academic argument. That there are people who like to see Muslims make this type of moral faux pas, moral failure. But we'll put that aside. What I care about, for this khutbah at least, is to give you an example of the ethics and the text. So these scholars pointed to the following Quranic revelation in Surah An-Nahl, the so-called the bee, as proof that the Qur'an itself recognizes slavery and accommodates slavery. As I will argue to you, the same verses that they cite and quote to, if you approach the Qur'an from an ethically committed perspective, will lead you to the exact opposite conclusions. The same verses that they point to as proof that the Qur'an itself recognizes slavery, if you approach these same verses from an ethically committed perspective, as an ethical human being reading the Qur'an, rather than an ethically neutralized human being reading the Qur'an, if you do so, you will reach the exact opposite conclusion. So here are the verses. First, I'm just going to read them in Arabic and then. ضرب الله مثلا عبدا مملوكا لا يقدر على شيء ومن رزقناه منا رزقا حسنا فهو ينفق منه سرا وجهرا هل يستويان الحمد لله بل أكثرهم لا يعلمون وضرب الله مثلا رجلين أحدهما أبكم لا يقدر على شيء وهو كل على مولاه أينما يوجهه لا يأتي بخير هل يستوي هو ومن يأمر بالعدل وهو على صراط مستقيم. Okay, translation. So God gives an example. First ayah, first verse, God gives an example of two people, a parable. A parable of two people. The first is a slave, could be translated as servant, possessed by a master, or slave, who has no power over anything. So the first is a slave who has no power over anything, juxtaposed to a person who have been given great bounties, who God has given great bounties to, a person who was bestowed a goodly provision from us, as the translation goes, meaning God has given that person a lot of good, and this person then expends it openly and secretly. So the first person is a disempowered slave, and the second person is, the implication is a free human being who has been given a great deal of material wealth, who spends it openly and secretly to do good. And then God asks the rhetorical question, are they equal? Can they be equal? Praise be to God, for most human beings do not know. The second verse gives you another parable. So there's parable number 1 and there's parable number 2. The second parable, God gives a parable. Again, 2 men. One of them is dumb. أبكم لا يقدر على شيء. So the one of them is dumb, unable to do anything, and is so ineffective that he is as if a burden upon his master. Wherever his master sends him, he brings no good. That person is juxtaposed to, that's a bad example, the juxtaposed to the good example, which is a person who enjoins justice and follows as-sirat al-mustaqim and follows the straight path. And then the rhetorical question again, are they equal? The implication is they're not equal. Now, some of these modern scholars, sadly, many of them converts to Islam, looked at these 2 verses and said, look, Allah is saying, I'm going to give you a parable. Is a wealthy, free human being equal to a disempowered slave? They're not. And is a powerless, dumb servant of a master who is entirely ineffective equal to someone who enjoins justice and follows the straight paths? They're not. It is true that in the Islamic tradition you will find Muslim historians and Muslim jurists who read these verses and derived from these verses the idea that slaves and free people are not equal. But they were not making an ethical point, they were making a legalistic point. And as lawyers, their epistemic universe, their world of consciousness, and their knowledge of legal precedent was anchored in their time and place. In other words, they've never seen a world without slaves, and they've never seen a world in which free people, free men or women, were equal to those who are slaves or indentured servants either, because a lot of people, by the way, another major source of slavery in the pre-modern world was that people who were heavily indebted, people who had a numerous amount of debts, instead of declaring bankruptcy, they would either sell themselves into slavery to satisfy their debt, or quite often they would sell their children into slavery. And this, by the way, continued on till even the 1940s, and maybe even later in some parts of the world. So, jurists who were not reading the Qur'an to make an ethical point, but were acting as jurists do to resolve conflicts, relied on legal precedents of their day and age, which only knew a world with slavery and with indentured servants. I'm never surprised when lawyers are not in search for the ethical thing to do, but are in search of the practical thing to do. Because that's how lawyers are trained. And that's how lawyers function. I am surprised, however, by those who are not lawyers, but primarily theologians, and are not weighed down by legal precedent, and fail to make the necessary ethical reading of the Qur'an in order to bring back an unethical situation. Because even the most accommodating medieval scholars in Islam perhaps accommodated slavery as a necessary evil, but they still saw it as an evil. The difference between them and the modern convert scholars that are starting to defend the institution of slavery is that they don't even see the institution of slavery as evil in the first place. They want to make it morally neutral, or simply condemned or non-condemned on the basis of sociological awareness. It's whatever people decide is good, and whatever people decide is bad, is bad. But there's nothing inherently moral or immoral. What I'm saying is that even those medieval Muslim jurists who accommodated slavery always understood that slavery, even if it's necessary, and even if they could not abolish it in their day and age, always saw it as an evil. Now, however, let's go back to the Quranic verses. You could, if you are ethically oblivious, read these two Quranic verses as if saying, you know, a free, wealthy man is not equal to a disempowered slave, and a person who pursues justice is not equal to a dumb slave. Conclusion, the Quran is fine with slavery. Well, actually, the Quran is making a very different point. Pay attention to these verses again. Allah is juxtaposing in the first parable an example of what we should not be versus what we should be. In fact, in the first parable, what is like paganism versus what is the light of Islam. When Allah draws an example as to what is similar to paganism, Allah picks the worst possible human condition. And what is the worst possible human condition? A disempowered slave. And Allah says, look, there are those, if you read what comes before and after these verses, look, there are those like the pagans who associate partners with Allah. Their likeness are like a thoroughly wrongful, let's use that word for now, wrongful situation. Disempowered slaves who don't even owe their destiny and don't have self-determination because they don't even have their own property. They can't spend. Versus a free human being who has autonomy over his or her own resources and can spend freely in the way of Allah. The first is a disempowered slave who cannot make his own or her own decisions, versus a human being who has autonomy and can make his and her own decisions. Who is closer to God and who is closer to pagans? the slave condition is closer to pagans, and the free man condition is closer to God. That's the first parable. The second parable is even a more powerful, resounding condemnation. Allah is saying the first man is like a dumb, ineffective human being. Those who are analogous to pagans. A dumb, ineffective, disempowered human being versus a human being that lives for justice, lives to establish justice. The first is closer to the moral state of pagans. The second is closer to the moral state of a Rabbaniyun, of godly human beings. Conclusion, readers of the Qur'an, be like the free, autonomous man or woman who decides where to spend his wealth, not the slave, because slavery is a pagan condition. Be like the man and woman who pursues justice, because if you don't, you're like a dumb, ineffective slave. No ethical human being can read these verses and say, well, Allah is telling us they're both, in this parable, both types, slave and non-slave, are fine. In fact, Allah tells you they're not equal. One is like paganism, the other is like me, God. One is not godly, and the other is godly. So in God's name, how do you converts, how do you scholars who converted to Islam and spent your entire life studying Islam, then read these verses and say, see, this is proof that slavery is not a moral, ethical issue? The verses are quite clear. All you need is an ethical reader, a moral reader, a reader who has a moral compass. Does it bother me? Does it bother me that most scholars who read these verses in the past didn't understand them the way I understand them? Well, it gives me pause. Yes, it bothers me. But does it stand as an obstacle? Absolutely not. Because this is why this is the final revelation and Muhammad is the final prophet. Is so it can yield its meanings generation after generation. If Allah wanted the meaning of this book frozen in the 10th century or the 12th century, Allah would not have made it the final message, and Muhammad would not have been the final prophet. The reason Muhammad is a final prophet is because the revelation, the prophecy of the Qur'an continues forever, generation after generation. So when you as a Muslim come today and you read these verses and you say, oh my Lord, I see something my ancestors haven't seen in this. This is actually condemning slavery as a form of paganism. It is an actually resounding moral condemnation of the institution of slavery. And yes, it gives you pause that your ancestors, burdened by their historical circumstance, might not have seen it that way, but it does not somehow invalidate or incapacitate you. Because you are a Khalifa, you are an agent, a viceroy, a deputy, a representative of God. This is a book of ethics, and it demands ethical readers. If you are not an ethical reader, the project of this book fails. If you don't have the moral sense to tell you that slavery is wrong, even if it was historically a necessary evil once upon a time, it was always an evil. And that is why Allah calls it فَلَقْتَحَمَ الْعَقَبَةِ فَكُّ رَقَبَةِ, that those who want to go through the difficult knot of the hereafter, free a slave. Your path to Allah is to free a slave. Free a slave. Freedom was always a morally praiseworthy condition, and lack of freedom was always a condemnable, damned condition. And these verses, which I've seen modern convert scholars, professors, cite as proof that the Qur'an supports slavery, in fact, it blew me away. They do exactly the opposite. They tell you slavery is paganism. And freedom is Islam. وَاسْأَلُ اللَّهَ يَسْتَشْهَدَ. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين الخاتم. The topic of slavery is huge, and if we would talk about it, it would take us a very long time, and I will readdress it in various khutbahs and chip away at it, because it disturbs me. I understand insane criminal people like Daesh and ISIS exploit the Islamic tradition in order to enslave and torment. That doesn't shock me, because they have so many problems already. They have serious criminal problems. But it bothers me when I see, especially a convert, who is in the West, who is an academic, or a non-academic, a preacher, a well-known preacher, a popular preacher, usually a white person, by the way, somehow want to philosophize the institution of slavery back into Islam, or wax it over, or wax apologetics towards it. Slavery was always an evil. The Qur'an teaches you that it was always an evil. Even if practiced by some companions, meaning that they owned slaves, like the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, who owned a slave, of course Hajar, the mother of Muslims, because Hajar was a slave. And if you read the Bible, stories of slavery are replete throughout the Bible, the Torah and the New Testament. And if you read your Bible, repeatedly slaves are told to obey their master like they would obey God. Someone recently wrote me saying, I having a crisis of faith because of the issue of slavery in Islam. No other religion practiced slavery. Where have you been living? Is it possible you're so ignorant? Don't you know that until the modern age, slavery existed in every part of the world and was as standard as currency? From China to Europe to Africa, no place in the world did not practice slavery. Slavery is in the Old Testament, slavery is in the New Testament, slavery is in every medieval text. Roman law had extensive sections on the law of slavery and what to do with slaves and how to treat slaves. why Islam didn't ban slavery is a very different question than the idiotic claim that Islam somehow exceptionally either established slavery or endorsed slavery or approved slavery. They're very different propositions and very different claims. But my point in this khutbah is the ethical human being. When the ethical human being accepts Allah and partners their ethics to Allah's teachings, the end result can be beauty. But if a human being wants to partner up with Allah and leave their ethics at the door, the end result will always be ugliness and fasad and corruption. An interesting story that I ran into recently as I'm reading some of the books of tradition that made me sort of pause and reflect. Some of you might know Eleazar the Damascus, a slave of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he features in the Bible. He's also in the Islamic tradition. Anyway, Eleazar was very close to the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and when the Prophet Lot was sent to Sodom and Gomorrah to preach amongst them, the Prophet Ibrahim, a lot of time had passed, and the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ had not heard from Prophet Lut and was wondering what is going on with the Prophet Lut and his people. So he calls upon his good student, because although he started out his slave, they became very close, and in some traditions it says that even Eleazar the Damascus might have been a prophet himself, although that's contested in the Islamic tradition. Anyway, so he tells Eleazar, why don't you go to Sodom to check on Lut alayhi salam, Prophet Lut, and make sure that he's okay. So Eleazar the Damascus takes his donkey and goes to Sodom, and when he enters the city, the town, he notices a lot of things that are wrong. There are just a lot of immorality in the streets, a lot of cheating in the market. But an incident happens before a judge that made me pause and think a lot about how human beings deal with narratives and text and history. So the Prophet, Eleazar, when he goes to Sodom, he's looking for the Prophet Lut. So he's asking around, do you guys know, have you seen him? Have you seen where Lut alayhi salam is? So he goes to a place, he ties his donkey outside, and he goes inside the store, or wherever it was, to search for the Prophet. When he comes out, he finds that someone has stolen his donkey. He asks around, has anyone seen who's taken my donkey? Who's taken my donkey? Finally, he finds out that such and such came, walked away with his donkey. He goes among the homes, he finds his donkey in someone's barn. He goes to this person, grabs him, and he says, I must take you to the judge. People try to convince Eleazar the Damascus not to go to the judge. He says, no, I'm going to take you to the judge. You stole my donkey, stealing is wrong. We must go to the judge. So they go to the judge. The judge says, what's going on? Eleazar the Damascus says, this man stole my donkey, walked away with it. I search for my donkey. I find his donkey in his barn. And stealing is wrong, and I'm here, so you hold him responsible. The judge looks at the man and says, okay, this is his donkey. Did you steal his donkey? The man says, well, Your Honor, this is not the way Eliezer sees it. I was walking, I saw the donkey outside. I thought to myself, why not take the donkey, feed him, rest him, groom him, and then his owner, when he finds him, he must pay me. He must pay me for the food and the grooming. Eliezer the Damascus said, what? Now I owe you money? He said, yes, surely you owe me money because I fed your donkey, I groomed him. Eliezer the Damascus says, but I didn't ask you to feed him or groom him. You came, you took my donkey, you went to the barn. He said, well, that's what I do. You want to prove that I stole him, that my intent was to keep him? Prove it. Do you deny that I fed him? No, I can't deny that. Do you deny that he looks groomed? He said, I can't deny that. But I am certain you stole him. So the judge, because again, remember, these are supposed to be the judges of Sodom, some of the most unfair judges ever. The judge says, I rule in favor of the robber. Eliezer, you owe him money for food and for grooming. Now I thought about this and said, innately, intuitively, if we know a story like this, a man parks his donkey, someone walks away with his donkey, and you retrieve the donkey, a clear-cut case of robbery, and the robber is guilty. But look at how human reason, you want to call it shaitan? Call it shaitan. But look at how human reason can come and flip logic and turn the ethics on its head. If someone argues to you, well, maybe, this man was a good doer. He walks around the markets, he finds donkeys or horses that look like they can use a meal, and that looks like they need grooming, and he took him to his place, and yes, Eliezer owes him for the grooming and the feeding because he did the service, and what's wrong with not holding him responsible? Do you really know that he intended to rob? Maybe he just forgot to tell Eliezer that he robbed. The ability of human beings to reason through the most twisted situations. That judge, if that judge is given in the Islamic tradition as an example of a corrupt and unjust judge, I wondered if the people of Sodom came and saw the judges of the Muslim world today in Egypt and Saudi and the Emirat and elsewhere. Because they do this and much worse. And it also reminded me of those scholars who defend Emirat just bombarded Yemenis, killing about 300 mixed military and civilians just a couple of days ago, or maybe yesterday. All these scholars who say, maybe Yemen is a land of tolerance, maybe it's good for Islam. All those scholars who stand by despots like Sisi and say, maybe he's fighting terrorism, maybe he's fighting the Ikhwan. The infinite ability of the human mind to overcome its ethical impulse and to overcome its innate God-given sense of justice and beauty. Exactly the way that you can find two Muslims reading the same verses, one person seeing in it a resounding condemnation of slavery as equal to paganism, and the other person reading these verses and saying, see, God recognizes the institution of slavery and the inherent and the inequality of slaves to free people in society. It is your moral conscience. That is why you must protect your moral conscience like you would take care of a very valuable piece of jewelry. Don't allow for the depreciation and deterioration of your moral conscience through the temptations of power, money, prestige, attention, publicity. These are the things that eat away at your moral conscience and bring and start activating the intellectualizing side of you, where you start diluting your innate moral sense, like the people of Sodom did with Eliazar's donkey. Don't be like the judge who decided that Eliazar the Damascus owes the robber money and grooming costs. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم اللهم اعف عنا وارحمنا واهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا وانصر الإسلام وأعز المسلمين يا رب العالمين. Allah forgive us our faults and our weaknesses, and aid us to be stronger, ethical human beings. And Allah allow us to discharge our obligations as your deputies and representatives on this earth. And Allah aid us to remain on the straight path, the path of beauty, justice, and truth. Ya Allah. Amin.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
آمين.
يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض له الملك وله الحمد وهو على كل شيء قدير. هو الذي خلقكم فمنكم كافر ومنكم مؤمن والله بما تعملون بصير. خلق السماوات والأرض بالحق وصوركم فأحسن صوركم وإليه المصير. يعلم ما في السماوات والأرض ويعلم ما تسرون وما تعلنون والله عليم بذات الصدور. ألم يأتكم نبأ الذين كفروا من قبل الذين كفروا من قبل فذاقوا وبال أمرهم ولهم عذاب أليم. الله أكبر. سمع الله حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
آمين.
ألم يأتكم نبأ الذين كفروا من قبل فذاقوا وبال أمرهم ولهم عذاب أليم. ذلك بأنه كانت تأتيهم رسلهم بالبينات فقالوا أبشر يهدوننا فكفروا وتولوا واستغنى الله والله غني حميد. زعم الذين كفروا أن لن يبعثوا قل بلى وربي لتبعثن ثم لتنبؤن بما عملتم ذلك على الله يسير. فآمنوا بالله ورسوله والنور الذي أنزلنا والله بما تعملون خبير. الله أكبر. سمع الله حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.